of you. Happy to be here at this conference and trying to speak and demystify a few things on the economy. I have a very big challenge or a couple of challenges in front of you. Number one, everybody here in the room is looking towards the Economist for an answer in terms of where the economy is moving. I'm not sure anybody in this room, including policymakers all across the world, has any answer. Number two, I have been preceded by two very eloquent speakers, and therefore I have to sort of follow in the same footsteps and try to sort of make my talk as interesting as possible. And there's another challenge that I also see for myself is to try and figure out how I talk about the Indian economy in just 20 minutes. So these are the three very critical challenges that I am facing, and I'll try to do my best on that. Now, before I actually sort of get into the Indian economy and trying to understand what is happening to the Indian economy, first of all, I'm not going to give any data. And I believe that most of the people here are experienced enough, and they are CFOs, and they are very close to the ground in terms of their respective businesses, who would have obviously an overarching belief and view on the economy and where their businesses are moving. And all businesses are obviously not moving in the same direction, and therefore we tend to continue to talk about, and this is there's another word that we have invented post-COVID, which is called a K-shaped recovery. Some sectors are doing relatively better, some sectors are not doing as good. Now, in my attempt to come to the Indian economy and discuss about the Indian economy, I think the critical issue that I have to first lay in front of you is how the global landscape is looking and how the global landscape has been changing, which also leads to an additional challenge apart from the domestic challenges that any emerging market economy like India has in terms of trying to progress the way they are trying to progress. Now, first of all, let us remember, or let us sort of take cognizance of the fact that, as Hoshi also pointed out with respect to the domestic economy, we have amazingly confusing signals. Now, as a career in economics, I have seen many ups and downs, many cyclical ups and cyclical lows. We have seen, I have seen and sort of studied crises like even the 1997 sort of emerging market Asia currency crisis. I have seen the great financial crisis, then the European debt crisis, then we saw through the COVID, and in my opinion, we are actually not away from the crisis in terms of the future that I am looking at. Now, this is what my belief is. Number one, I think the confusing signals that are happening across the world with respect to the landscape, in terms of policy making, it becomes very difficult when I look at policy. Now, why I bring up policy making is that is very important in terms of facing, shaping up the future of any economy, shaping up the future of the world. And if policy making is something that is challenging at this point in time, I think that's the one most ultimate issue that we have out here. Now, sticking to the global economy, I think the critical challenge that we see here is that one segment of the economy is doing well. The growth is relatively more stable, but you still have a challenge in terms of inflation. So therefore, the challenge facing the central bankers is, do they look at the growth? Do they look at the inflation? If you are a credible central banker and if you have an inflation targeting mechanism, then obviously you will look at inflation and therefore you would want to raise rates. But there's another challenge that is coming up because you are raising rates, and this is an even graver challenge. What does a central bank look at? Does it look at financial stability or does it look at macro stability? Now, if you are trying to look at the macro stability, then obviously you will try and increase the interest rates in an order to reduce the demand in the economy, and therefore you have a good launch pad for the economy for the next growth phase that you would be looking at. But if you are looking at the financial stability aspect, then you will obviously not want to raise rates, because higher interest rates would sort of vitiate the the high debt and repayment of the debt, both in terms of interest and principal, will become a problem. And that's what we have seen in some of the bank cases or bank failure cases in the US, that it was purely a resultant of the higher interest rates that the US economy has launched itself. So that's the other challenge that we have. And till this point in time, I also put it on record that even the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, has to a certain extent been on the side of macro stability, which necessarily means, according to me, irrespective of all the noises that is happening in the global economy as to whether the US should pause and whether the US should cut, even if they don't hike one last time in June, which I still strongly believe, and I read the minutes of the US Federal Reserve yesterday. The House was divided, but there were still strong cases where people felt that interest rates continue to need to go up, which necessarily means that the central bank would be looking at financial stability aspects in a very different way, which is basically providing liquidity, sort of ring fencing the depositors so that the stress that we see in certain bank cases do not flow across the economy, and therefore it does not become a systemic risk. So the central bankers and the policymakers therefore are struggling to find the thin line between what they called policy making for macro stability versus policy making for financial stability, but they have to keep an eye on both. The other dimension that is emerging is the fiscal policy. Now, during the COVID period, we had just pumped, all governments across the world have pumped liquidity in the system. And and even the Indian economy has sort of pumped a huge amount of fiscal spending in the system. They had taken us 9.2% fiscal deficit GDP at one point in time, then they went down to 6.4. Now they are targeting 5.9. But to a certain extent, all these numbers are a Excel sheet number in the sense that along with the numerator, the denominator has also gone up, which necessarily means that even if you are trying to show a fiscal consolidation out of a reduction in the fiscal deficit GDP number, your borrowing numbers and your overall, the numerical fiscal deficit number continues to go up. We'll come back to that later. But the point that I'm trying to make is that as the monetary policy across the world tightens, it becomes very difficult also for the fiscal push to happen, something that had sort of to a certain extent propelled the growth momentum during the COVID and post-COVID. And this is where the challenge also will be in terms of the policy making. How do we mesh together the fiscal policy versus the monetary policy, stabilize the economy, have financial stability, and therefore move the world? Apart from that, I think the various other challenges that policymakers across the world is struggling with, one is a very important thing, and that's called deglobalization. Now remember, we had, in terms of most of the push that the emerging market space and the sort of East Asian economies had in terms of their growth momentum, was clearly looking at the export market. But today we have deglobalization not only in terms of trade, but deglobalization to a certain extent also in terms of labor mobility, and this is what the critical challenge for the economy is. Now, apart from that, the last challenge from the global perspective before I land into my domestic issues, the last challenge and not the least is the very fact that we have an aging population across the world. And where does this aging population fit in terms of my overall story? Definitely an aging population to a certain extent might to us mean that it's lower consumption demand, and therefore to that extent it would be a lesser inflation and a lesser growth. But let's look at it in a different way. Now, the moment we talk about an aging population, especially in countries like, say, Canada, US, Europe, what really came out in form of data is during the COVID and during the supply shock, the countries which had seen a significantly higher inflation were countries who were facing a bigger challenge in terms of the aging demographics. So there is definitely a link between inflation and aging demographics, and this is possibly how it is. The moment you have an aging demographics, first of all, the dependency ratio goes up, which necessarily means there has to be more towards savings, or the same amount of goods that you produce are relatively more consumed than being invested, which hurts the future growth potential of the economy. So that's one part of the story. The bigger part of the story is that the moment you see the aging population hitting you, you have labor supplies which is crunching. And as labor supplies crunch, your labor costs go up, which necessarily means your inflation is on the higher side. So you can't invest because you have a problem in terms of the productive capacity of the economy, and a lot is going towards saving, and therefore you can't push up the future supplies. But on the other side, you have a challenge in terms of higher inflation because of the reason that I just talked about, and therefore where does the policymaker land itself into? So that is the significant challenge I think central banks will continue to face for some time, and therefore my critical message to CFOs in this room is that even if we wish for lower interest rates, we will possibly not be getting lower interest rates in a hurry. We may be talking about, and this is the other crucial bit, is that what we are seeing now is a very divergent pull between market participants like me, who would want lower interest rates and grow our business from a financial sector perspective. On the other hand, you have a central bank who is trying to signal something else, and therefore the tug of war between the central bank and the market may actually imply, or does actually imply, that all the people in this room and who are active CFOs and managing the finances in the company will have to see complexities, volatilities within the financial markets, and that's the life for us. I don't know till how many sort of years from here on. And I sincerely hope that, unlike my previous speaker, I sincerely hope that we don't have another COVID-related shutdown, because that would be another big mess that might actually come up for the economy, because policy doesn't really have space anymore to react. Now, that's where the overall sort of architecture in terms of the global economy is, and this is now where India lies. Now, the way I look at India is the macros are looking good, no doubt. We have seen an inflation softening, but even as I say, I am not expecting inflation to soften or give the central bank that much comfort in terms of cutting interest rates at a fast pace and in the very near future. So that's one thing settled for me, that interest rates are likely to remain on the higher side for some period of time. We don't have a financial sector problem in India. Yes, you might see isolated cases of financial stress, but I think the way India and the regulator looks at the financial system, unlike, say, advanced economies like the US or the Europe, the central bank in India can't allow any financial entity in India to actually sort of go bust. And this is where I think the policy making from the Central Bank of India becomes that much more relevant in terms of how it looks at financial stability. And I'll leave this point over there. But coming back to the macros of India, yes, the macros are looking good. Yes, there is expectation that exports may not perform well because of the deglobalization, because of the lack of demand from the rest of the world. However, having said that, the other challenge, which is a micro challenge, is how we need to grow our exports. First of all, there's a technology challenge in terms of the exports. And as I talk of the technology challenge, it is very evident that there is a very significant embedded component of imports into our exports. Now, here is, I think, the micro challenge that we are emerging into. At the time of the 1991, when we were hit by the crisis, the low-hanging fruit was the services sector. Therefore, we moved totally from the agricultural sector, which was the focus point, and we were employing about 57% of labor in the agricultural sector. A certain amount of that moved into the services sector, and typically more into the construction sector. And that's the journey that we have seen, and the services sector has grown in strength. We talk about the ITES services, which continue to do well. But the critical piece that is missing for India, and I as an economist also don't have a very clear answer to it, is the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector, with all the endeavors of this government, including the reduction in the corporate tax rate, we have not seen the share of the manufacturing sector grow. We continue to keep talking about employment growth in the manufacturing sector. We have not really seen the same type of employment growth that we had wished for. Mr. Gaswala also did talk about certain large conglomerates which have been laying off workers, or they have been sort of looking at tightening their belt around in terms of the HR costs. That becomes important because people are important to any organization, and any failure of business on the demand side needs to be addressed through a cost measure on the company in itself. And therefore, the eternal question that I have always raised about India is that for the last 15 years, I myself have been talking about the demographic dividend. And let me be very frank over here in this room, in this closed room, in the sense that whether demographic dividend is turning out to be a boon for us or it is turning out to be a huge challenge for us is a question that I really don't know how to answer. Now, my point therefore is, in terms of if I have to look India into a slightly longer term future direction and how India needs to move forward, first of all, I think we have to forget about 8% growth. We would be happy growing at 6.5%. If that growth is equitable, that's very important. If labor force participation in India improves, now, just to give you some data on the labor force participation, this is, I think, the other micro challenge that India has. In 2005, the male labor force participation was 86%. Today, we have dropped to 80%. In 2008, the female labor force participation was about 34%. Today, we have dropped close to 22%, which is a very significant drop. And if you hear sort of multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the IMF talking about it, the amount of productivity loss and the GDP loss in the economy could be as high as 1 to 1.5%, considering the peak labor force participation that we were. Now, where is the answer to improving this labor force participation? The easiest answer to this labor force participation, maybe from the women's side, is to get law and order in the economy in shape, which allows women workforce to actually move out and work more freely without any fear of anything. In certain parts of the country, we see that happening, but I think that still a certain amount of challenge is there in a significant amount of parts of the country, especially in the sort of the tier 2 and tier 3 in the rural areas, where the women force may not be allowed to work post a certain sort of number of hours or etc. So these are some of the micro challenges that we would be looking at. The other micro challenge for me is obviously the education and the health sector. Now, I'm sorry to say that even as we have launched ourselves into a development plan, the government has, and including the center and the states, has possibly not done enough in terms of providing a boost to the education sector as well as the health sector. And data actually shows for itself. While midday meals have ensured that we have 100% or a close to 100% enrollment in the primary schools, especially also in the rural segment. To a certain extent, there were disruptions out of COVID, but we have sort of worked around that, and we are back to more or less the same levels in the pre-COVID era. But there is a significant amount of dropout that we see as we move from the primary sector to the secondary sector, and this is where I think the critical focus needs to be. Studies which look at the input versus the output case from an educational perspective, or the literacy and the numeracy perspective, clearly says that there are about only 1/4 of class 3 student who is able to do or read very fluently a class 3 vernacular, leave aside reading English. And almost about a similar number can only do a class 3 mathematics. So there's a significant gap that I see, even as we tend to talk about skill development, skill management. I see a significant amount of gap in these segments before we actually move to talking the skill development and the skill segment, which is at a slightly relatively higher level. Studies also show that even if a large company is interviewing a candidate who has relatively good amount of education in India today, sometimes the soft skills don't match to the requirement, and therefore that guy doesn't get job. So these are the issues that need to be sorted out from a micro perspective before we actually sort of tend to talk about a significantly higher amount of growth in the Indian economy. And these are something which are very, very essential if we have to harness the demographic dividends that we still have today, unlike the aging populations of the Western world. And that's possibly a reason why also our macros are looking relatively better. I did talk about the fact that countries who have faced the maximum amount of inflation burst during the period of the COVID and the supply crisis of the Russia-Ukraine were countries which had a relatively higher aging population. And in some cases, the inflation burst was to the extent of almost 6 to 8 times of the normal base level. In India, we didn't have that. First of all, the policy on the fiscal side were less open than the fiscal policies of the Western world, but we still had some amount of fiscal push, and we still had the population dividend in our favor, which therefore looks to be a better management happening in terms of the inflation. So once again, I think the overall message that I need to provide for is, number one, for India as an economy, the macros are looking good, but it's not the current issues that we need to be factoring in and lauding ourselves on. We need to relatively look much, much longer term and sort of sort out all the micro challenges that I have pointed out. Equitable distribution of income is very essential. We keep talking about why India, or the way we look at India in a more passionate way. We always think that the rating agencies, sovereign rating agencies, should up India ratings. But if I really look at the peer countries and where their per capita income lies versus our per capita income, we are much lower. Unless we get these micros in order, it will be very difficult for us to actually grow up and get into the higher income category. We are more or less otherwise stuck in the low income category in the world economies, and therefore as we go forward and as the demographic dividend dissipates, it would possibly be very difficult to sort of grow the Indian economy. So that's I think the critical challenge that we have, apart from all the other facets from the international perspective that I have pointed out, which necessarily means, and very strong message, let us not, on the finance side mostly, let us not expect interest rates to come down at a rapid pace and soon, even as our inflation is relatively on the lower side. I think the Central Bank of India, the Reserve Bank, will be hawk-eyed on inflation, will continue to look at how food inflation behaves in India. Services inflation, my previous speaker talked about he didn't give a number, but he did talk about an emergency travel between Delhi and Bombay. My daughter studies in Dehradun, and if you want to travel out of Dehradun to Bombay on a Sunday, the fares are nothing less than 25 to 26,000 rupees. So that's the service sector inflation that we are seeing. Yes, the services sector is doing well, which is the obvious conclusion of this. But on the other side, I think unless we have a more equitable distribution of income, it will be very difficult for the government, even from the perspective of revenue collections and how much of expenditure that they would be able to put out. And more importantly, it would be very difficult for the government to reduce the overhang of public debt and therefore provide once again room for itself in terms of the future sort of push. So one, don't expect interest rates to come down. Two, financial markets volatility will be strong. Three, I would still expect that there is still some amount of sort of pushback from companies, and there would be a lagged reaction from companies in terms of investing in capacities, even though we tend to read in the media that everything is looking hunky-dory, interest rates are not that high, balance sheets are clean, but unless that company sees demand, the future demand building out over a 5 to 7 year period, it would be very difficult for investments to come on stream in a very strong way. Thank you very much for the patient listening. I know I have been bombarding at every level, but I have tried to put the whole thing together to make it a cogent story from my perspective. Thank you very much once again for the patient listening.